The hall shimmered under golden lights that made everything look softer than reality, as if the truth itself had been wrapped in silk and hidden behind carefully chosen smiles and polished laughter, and I stood near the back trying to become part of the wall rather than a person anyone would notice, because tonight was not supposed to be about me. It was supposed to be about my sister, the perfect bride, the favorite daughter, the one who never seemed to make mistakes, the one everyone adored, while I had long ago learned how to disappear into the background with quiet grace and lowered eyes. My black dress was simple, almost invisible compared to the glittering gowns around me, and I chose it that way because attention had become something I avoided, like a wound that refused to heal. Every conversation I overheard felt like a whisper about me, every glance like a question I was tired of answering without words, and yet I came tonight despite everything, despite the exhaustion that sat deep in my bones, despite the long hours at the hospital, despite the silent battles no one here even knew existed. I came because she was my sister, and some part of me still believed that meant something, still hoped that blood could hold us together even when understanding had long since fallen apart. But hope can be fragile, and mine began to crack the moment I stepped inside and felt the subtle shift in the room, the way voices lowered slightly, the way a few heads turned just enough to acknowledge my presence without welcoming it. I forced a smile, because that is what you do when you are no longer sure of your place in a family. You perform normalcy, you pretend everything is fine even when you can feel the distance growing like a shadow behind every word. Where have you been lately? One of my cousins asked as she walked past, her tone light but her eyes sharp with curiosity that did not feel kind. I kept my voice steady. Busy hospital work. I said the same answer I had given countless times, the same explanation that never seemed to satisfy anyone. Oh, right, your hospital visits, she replied with a smirk that carried more meaning than the words themselves, and I felt that familiar sting, the one that had become almost routine. They never asked what I did at the hospital, never asked who I helped or what I saw. They only questioned why I was not around, why I missed birthdays, dinners, gatherings, as if my absence was a choice made out of indifference rather than necessity, as if I had decided one day that family mattered less than everything else. And maybe in their eyes that is exactly what it looked like. Maybe all they saw was someone who drifted in and out of their lives without explanation, someone unreliable, someone distant, someone who no longer fit into the picture they had painted of who I should be. And tonight that image was about to shatter in a way none of them expected. The music softened as the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. My sister stepped onto the stage, her white dress glowing under the lights, her smile radiant and effortless, as if happiness came naturally to her, as if she had never known doubt or struggle or the heavy weight of being misunderstood. The room fell silent in admiration, and I felt a strange mix of pride and distance watching her stand there, so confident, so loved, so certain of her place in the world. Thank you all for being here on the most important day of my life, she began, her voice clear and warm, and the guests responded with gentle applause, their attention completely hers, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to relax, to believe that maybe tonight would pass without incident, maybe I could remain unnoticed, just another face in the crowd, just another quiet presence blending into the celebration. But then her gaze shifted and found me, and something in her expression changed, not dramatically, not enough for others to notice, but enough for me to feel it like a warning. And I knew in that instant that I had been wrong about how the night would unfold. And I especially want to thank my dear sister, she continued, raising her glass slightly as if offering me a gesture of affection that felt hollow. The room turned toward me, instinctively drawn by the mention, and I felt the weight of their attention settle over me like a spotlight I never asked for, who somehow managed to show up tonight despite her very mysterious hospital visits. The words landed softly, but the laughter that followed did not. It started as a ripple, then grew louder, spreading across the room as people exchanged amused glances, as if they had all been thinking the same thing, as if her comment had simply given them permission to voice it openly. My chest tightened and I felt the heat rise to my face, but I did not move, I did not speak. I simply stood there, absorbing the moment, as if enduring it would somehow make it less real. She is always disappearing, my sister went on, her tone playful but edged with something sharper, something that cut deeper than humor. We never really know if she is saving lives or just avoiding family responsibilities. More laughter, louder this time, less restrained, and I realized with a sinking feeling that this was not a passing joke. This was how they saw me. This was the story they had created in my absence, and tonight she had chosen to share it with everyone, turning my silence into entertainment, turning my sacrifices into something trivial, something worthy of ridicule. I felt every eye in the room on me, some curious, some judgmental, some perhaps even sympathetic, but none understanding, because understanding requires truth, and truth was the one thing I had kept hidden, not out of shame but out of necessity. I had thought that one day it would all make sense, that when the time was right they would see me differently, that they would understand why I had been gone, why I had missed so much, why I had chosen the path that led me away from them again and again. But Standing there in that moment surrounded by laughter that felt like betrayal, I realized how naive that hope had been. They had already decided who I was, and no amount of silence was going to change that. I had sacrificed sleep, my own health, my peace of mind for those hospital visits. I had stood in rooms where life hung by a thread, where every second mattered, where failure was not just a mistake but a loss that could never be undone. I had carried burdens they would never see, made choices they would never have to face, and yet here I was reduced to a punchline in a wedding toast, a source of amusement on a night that was supposed to celebrate love and unity. The irony was almost unbearable. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, to tell them everything, to shatter their assumptions with the truth, but the words stayed trapped inside me because some truths cannot be revealed until the right moment, and that moment had not yet come. Instead, I felt something else take hold, something quieter but stronger than anger, a resolve that settled deep within me, steady and unshakable. I did not need to argue, I did not need to justify myself, not here, not now, because the truth was coming, whether they were ready for it or not, and when it did, it would speak louder than anything I could say. In this room filled with laughter that did not belong to me, I slowly reached for my purse, my movements calm, deliberate, as if nothing had changed, as if I had not just been exposed in a way that stripped me of dignity in front of everyone I had once called family. The music began again, hesitant at first, as if unsure whether it was appropriate to continue, then gradually returning to its earlier rhythm as people turned their attention back to the celebration, eager to move past the discomfort, eager to pretend that nothing significant had just occurred. But for me, everything had shifted. Something fragile had broken beyond repair, and in its place stood a clarity I had never felt before. I was done waiting for them to understand, done hoping that my silence would one day be interpreted as strength instead of weakness, done allowing their perceptions to define me. I turned away from the stage, from my sister, from the crowd that had just laughed at my expense, and walked toward the exit, each step lighter than the last, not because the pain had disappeared, but because I finally understood that I did not belong in the version of the story they had created for me. And what they did not know, what none of them could possibly imagine, was that tonight was not just her big day, it was the beginning of something else, something far more powerful than their laughter, something that would change everything. And as I stepped out into the cool night air, leaving behind the music, the lights, the illusion of perfection, I allowed myself one quiet breath, one moment of stillness before everything shifted, because the truth has a way of arriving when it is least expected, and when it does not ask for permission, it simply reveals itself. And tonight it was finally ready to be seen. The cold night air wrapped around me the moment I stepped outside, and it felt sharper than it should have, as if the world itself had decided to strip away the warmth that never truly belonged to me in the first place. And for a few seconds I just stood there on the edge of the grand entrance, staring at the dimly lit pathway that stretched ahead like a quiet escape from everything that had just happened inside. My chest rose and fell slowly as I tried to steady my breathing, but the echoes of laughter still clung to me, refusing to fade, refusing to let me forget the way my own sister had turned me into a joke in front of a room full of people who never cared to understand me. And yet beneath the sting there was something else, something deeper and far more powerful than humiliation. It was the weight of truth, the kind of truth that sits silently until the moment it decides to surface and change everything. They had no idea, none of them did, not my sister, not my parents, not the relatives who whispered behind soft smiles and polite greetings, because I never told them, I never explained where I went or why I stayed away or what those long exhausting nights at the hospital really meant to me. I let them believe what they wanted because I thought it was easier, because I thought protecting the truth was more important than defending myself, and maybe part of me hoped that one day they would trust me enough to stop questioning my absence. But that day never came. Instead, the silence grew heavier and their assumptions grew louder, until tonight, when everything finally spilled into the open, disguised as humor, disguised as harmless teasing, when in reality it was something much colder, something that revealed exactly how little they valued the sacrifices I had been making for months. Those so-called hospital visits were never casual, they were never optional, they were never something I could simply skip for the sake of a family dinner or a celebration. They were emergencies, they were lives hanging in the balance, they were decisions made in seconds that could determine whether someone walked out alive or never walked out at all. I had seen things that changed me in ways I could not explain. I had stood beside patients whose families waited outside praying for miracles, while I fought alongside machines and monitors trying to give them one more chance, one more breath, one more moment. And every time I left that hospital, I carried a piece of those nights with me, a weight that settled quietly into my bones, making it harder to pretend that everything was normal when I stepped back into a world that measured presence by appearances rather than purpose, but the truth ran deeper than long hours and exhaustion, deeper than the simple explanation of being overworked, because months ago something happened that shifted everything, something that forced me into a position I never expected to be in. I had witnessed negligence, not the kind that could be ignored or excused, but the kind that endangered lives, the kind that made my hands shake with anger and disbelief because it came from someone who was supposed to know better, someone trusted, someone respected, someone whose name carried authority within the hospital walls and beyond. At first I told myself there must be a reason, there must be something I did not understand, but the more I observed, the clearer it became. This was not a mistake, this was a pattern. Shortcuts taken, procedures rushed, decisions made without the care they demanded, and each time I saw it my chest tightened because I knew what it meant. I knew the risk, I knew the consequences, and I knew that staying silent would make me just as responsible as the person committing those acts. So I did something that changed my life in ways I could never have predicted. I reported it quietly, carefully documenting everything, gathering evidence, noting details that could not be dismissed. It was not an easy decision. It was not something I did without fear, because I understood exactly what I was up against. This was not just any doctor. This was someone with connections, someone whose influence extended far beyond the hospital, someone who could easily turn the system against me if given the chance. But I could not look away. I could not pretend I had not seen what I saw, because every patient deserved better. Every life mattered too much to be reduced to convenience or carelessness. And so I filed the complaint, knowing that from that moment forward nothing would be the same. And I was right. The shift was immediate, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore. My schedule changed without explanation. My hours became unpredictable. My requests were questioned. My presence scrutinized. It was as if the hospital itself had turned into a maze designed to wear me down, to make me doubt my decision, to make me regret speaking up. I became the difficult one, the unreliable one, the one who could not be counted on, because I was always somewhere else, always busy, always unavailable. But the truth was, I was exactly where I needed to be, doing exactly what had to be done, even when it cost me everything else in my life. I stopped attending family gatherings, not because I did not care, but because I could not risk saying too much or being asked questions I could not answer. I withdrew into a routine that revolved entirely around the hospital and the investigation that quietly unfolded behind closed doors. Late nights turned into early mornings. Sleep became a luxury I could not afford, and the person I used to be slowly faded into someone stronger, but far more isolated. And through it all I said nothing to my family. I let them believe their version of the story, because the truth was not mine to share. Not yet. The investigation required silence, required patience, required trust in a process that felt painfully slow at times, but necessary. And so I endured their whispers, their doubts, their judgments, because I believed that one day the truth would speak for itself, that one day everything I had sacrificed would make sense, that one day they would see me not as someone who disappeared, but as someone who stood her ground when it mattered most. And that day was closer than they realized. Earlier that morning, before the wedding, before the laughter, before the humiliation, I received a message, one that made my hands still and my breath catch as I read the words carefully, making sure I had not misunderstood. The medical board has concluded the investigation. We will arrive tonight. For a moment the world seemed to pause as those words settled into my mind. Tonight, not tomorrow, not next week, but tonight. The same night my sister stood under bright lights celebrating her perfect moment. The same night I was reduced to a joke in front of everyone who had doubted me. The timing felt almost unreal, as if fate itself had decided that silence had lasted long enough, that the truth was ready to step forward and claim its place. And there was more. The doctor I had reported was not just a colleague, not just a name in a file. He was connected to this family, to this wedding, to the very people who had laughed at me. He was the groom's father, a man admired, respected, trusted without question, a man whose reputation stood unchallenged until now. And suddenly everything made sense. The subtle tensions, the careful avoidance, the unspoken pressure, it was all tied together in ways I had not fully realized until this moment. And as I stood outside the venue, the cool air no longer felt harsh. It felt grounding. It felt like a reminder that I had done what was right, regardless of how it looked, regardless of how it was perceived inside those walls. They had laughed at me because they did not know, but they would know soon enough. The truth was no longer something I had to carry alone. It was coming with authority, with evidence, with voices that could not be dismissed. And in less than an hour everything would change, not just for me, but for everyone inside that hall. The laughter would fade, the assumptions would crumble, and the story they had told themselves about who I was would be replaced by something far more real, far more uncomfortable, far more undeniable. I took a deep breath, letting it fill my lungs slowly as a sense of calm settled over me, not the kind that comes from forgetting pain, but the kind that comes from knowing it will finally be acknowledged. I turned back toward the entrance, the lights inside still glowing, the music still playing, as if nothing had shifted, as if the world remained Exactly the same, but I knew better because sometimes the biggest changes happen quietly beneath the surface until the moment they can no longer be contained, and as I stepped forward ready to walk back into that room, I understood that tonight was not just about enduring the judgment, it was about witnessing the moment when truth finally stood in the center of it all and refused to be ignored. I stepped back into the hall just as the music swelled again, soft and polished as if nothing had been disturbed, as if laughter had not cut through me only minutes ago, and for a moment it almost felt unreal how quickly everything returned to normal, how easily people slipped back into celebration when the discomfort passed them by like a brief shadow that no one wanted to hold on to. The light still shimmered across the ceiling, casting a warm glow over smiling faces. Glasses clinked gently in small circles of conversation, and the scent of flowers and perfume lingered in the air, creating an illusion of perfection that felt fragile now, as if one small shift could crack it wide open and reveal what lay underneath. I moved quietly along the edge of the room, unnoticed once again, blending into the background that had become my place for so long, and yet something inside me had changed, something steady and unmovable, like a quiet certainty that the moment I had been waiting for was no longer distant. It was approaching with each passing second. I could feel it in the way my heartbeat slowed instead of racing, in the way my hands remained still instead of trembling. I was no longer bracing myself for the judgment. I was preparing for something else entirely. Across the room, my sister stood surrounded by guests, her laughter light, her smile effortless as she leaned into conversations that praised her beauty, her happiness, her perfect day, and for a brief second I watched her, not with anger but with a strange sense of distance, as if I were seeing her clearly for the first time, not as the sister I had grown up with, but as someone who had chosen to believe, a version of me that was easier to mock than to understand. And I wondered if she would still be laughing in an hour, if she would still carry that same certainty in her voice when everything shifted. The music softened again as another round of speeches seemed to begin, but before anyone could step forward, before another carefully crafted moment could take shape, something subtle changed near the entrance. It was not loud, it was not dramatic, but it was enough, a quiet disruption that moved like a ripple through the room, drawing attention without demanding it. The doors opened slowly, and 3 figures stepped inside, their presence calm but unmistakably serious, their attire formal, their expressions composed in a way that did not match the celebratory atmosphere around them. And almost immediately the energy in the room shifted. Conversations faltered, laughter faded into uncertain murmurs, and heads turned instinctively toward the unfamiliar interruption as curiosity spread like a whisper. "Who are they?" someone asked softly nearby. "Is everything okay?" another voice followed, carrying a hint of unease that had not existed moments before. I felt it then, that quiet recognition settling into place as my eyes met theirs, and in that instant there was no doubt these were the people I had been waiting for. The medical board had arrived. My breath remained steady, but something deep inside me tightened, not with fear but with anticipation, because this was the moment where silence ended and truth began to take its place at the center of everything. The lead official stepped forward, his posture straight, his gaze focused as he moved through the crowd with a calm authority that parted the room without force, simply by presence alone. "We apologize for the interruption," he said, his voice clear and measured, carrying across the hall in a way that commanded attention without raising volume. The music stopped completely now, leaving only the echo of his words hanging in the air and the faint clink of a glass being set down somewhere in the distance. My sister turned from where she stood, her expression shifting from confusion to concern as she looked toward the unexpected guests standing where no one had been invited. "We are here regarding an ongoing investigation involving malpractice at City General Hospital." The words landed heavily, cutting through the room with a weight that could not be ignored, and I saw it then, the flicker of recognition in a few faces, the subtle tightening of posture, the way certain glances were exchanged quickly and then hidden, as if people were already trying to distance themselves from something they did not yet fully understand. My heart pounded once, but I held my ground, remaining exactly where I was as the official continued, his tone steady, unwavering. "We have concluded our findings and are here to formally address those involved." A pause followed, not long but significant enough to stretch the tension further, to allow the meaning of his words to settle into every corner of the room before the name was spoken. And when it was, everything changed. It was as if the air itself shifted, becoming heavier, harder to breathe, as all eyes turned in the same direction, not toward me, not yet, but toward the groom's father, a man who had carried himself with pride and confidence throughout the evening, a man whose reputation stood tall among those gathered here, a man who now looked as if the ground beneath him had begun to give way. His face lost color, his expression tightening as realization crept in slowly at first, and then all at once he attempted to speak, his lips parting slightly as if to form a defense, but no words came, the authority of the moment silencing him more effectively than any command could have. This investigation, the official continued, his voice firm but controlled, was initiated by a report filed several months ago, and I felt it then, the shift that came before revelation, the kind that moves quietly through a room just before everything becomes clear, the kind that pulls attention toward its source before anyone fully understands why. And then came the words that turned that quiet shift into something undeniable. Our primary witness and reporting doctor is present here tonight. Silence followed, not the gentle silence of anticipation, but the heavy silence of shock. The kind that presses against the walls and settles into every breath taken within the space. No one spoke, no one moved. For a brief moment it was as if time itself had paused, waiting for the next piece of truth to fall into place, and then slowly, almost hesitantly, heads began to turn. Searching, scanning the room as if trying to locate the person being described, as if hoping perhaps that it was someone distant, someone unknown, someone whose presence would not disrupt the delicate balance of the evening. And one by one their gazes found me. It started with a few, then spread until the entire room seemed to align in that single direction, eyes widening, expressions shifting from curiosity to disbelief to something deeper, something closer to realization. I did not move, I did not look away. I simply stood there, allowing the weight of their attention to settle over me in a way that felt entirely different from before. This was not the attention of mockery or misunderstanding. This was something else, something sharper, something edged with the beginning of truth. My sister stared at me, her face frozen, her earlier confidence replaced by confusion that bordered on shock, as if she were trying to reconcile the image she held of me with the reality unfolding in front of her. The groom's father looked as well, his expression no longer controlled, no longer composed, but fractured by a sudden awareness that connected him directly to me in a way he had not anticipated. Whispers began again, but they were different now, no longer light or amused, but urgent, questioning, uncertain. What is happening? Someone murmured. She reported it. Another voice whispered almost disbelievingly, and through it all I remained still, because this moment did not require movement, it did not require explanation, not. Yet the truth was unfolding on its own, carried by voices that could not be dismissed, by authority that stood above personal bias. And as the weight of that truth settled deeper into the room, I understood something clearly. There was no turning back from this point. The story they had told about me, the assumptions they had built over months of silence, were already beginning to crack, and in their place something far more powerful was rising, something undeniable, something that would force each person present to confront not only what they had believed about me, but what they had chosen to ignore about the world around them. The official's gaze shifted briefly toward me, not seeking confirmation, but acknowledging presence, and in that silent exchange I felt the final piece fall into place. The moment had arrived, not with chaos, not with anger, but with a quiet authority that demanded to be heard. And as I took a single step forward, the sound of my movement barely audible against the heavy silence, I knew that everything from this point onward would change, not because I raised my voice, not because I defended myself, but because the truth had finally stepped into the light and refused to be hidden any longer. I stood there for a moment longer, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room settle on me in a way that was completely different from before, because this time it was not filled with amusement or quiet judgment. It was filled with shock, with confusion, with something that slowly began to resemble understanding. And without rushing, without allowing emotion to break the calm I had built so carefully inside myself, I took a step forward, then another. My movements steady, controlled, as if each step carried the quiet strength of everything I had endured to reach this moment. The polished floor reflected the soft glow of the chandeliers above, and for a brief second I caught a glimpse of myself in that reflection, not the version they had mocked, not the distant figure they had reduced to whispers, but someone grounded, someone certain, someone who no longer needed to explain her worth through words. Alone, the officials stood beside me, their presence firm and unshaken, and as I reached them I turned slightly to face the room, allowing my gaze to move across the sea of familiar faces that now looked unfamiliar in their silence. Yes, I said, my voice calm, even measured, carrying clearly through the stillness. I filed the report. The words did not need force, they did not need anger, because their power lay in their simplicity, in the truth they held. And the reaction was immediate. A ripple of gasps spread across the room, some sharp, some hushed, as if people were unsure how loudly they were allowed to respond to what they were hearing. My sister's expression changed again, disbelief giving way to something more fragile, something closer to realization. Her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to speak, but no sound came, and for the first time that night she looked uncertain, not of the situation, but of me. You mocked my hospital visits, I continued, my eyes steady as they met hers, and then moved beyond her to the others. Those visits were not excuses. They were not escapes, they were hours spent standing between life and loss. They were nights where every decision mattered, where every second carried weight you could not see and could not understand because I never asked you to carry it. With me, I paused not for effect, but because the room itself seemed to need a moment to absorb what had already been said. The groom's father shifted where he stood, his earlier confidence completely gone, replaced by attention. That was impossible to hide. He opened his mouth again, perhaps to defend himself, perhaps to deny what was unfolding, but the official beside me raised a hand, gently yet firmly, stopping him before any words could form. The evidence is clear, the official stated, his tone steady, authoritative. Multiple violations, repeated negligence actions that directly endangered patients' lives. The consequences of these findings are immediate suspension pending further legal action. The words fell into the room like a final verdict, each one sealing the reality that could no longer be denied, and the reaction that followed was no longer quiet whispers, but a wave of hushed voices rising in confusion and disbelief, in the uncomfortable recognition that something serious, something undeniable had taken place in the very space where moments earlier there had only been celebration. I turned my attention back to my sister because despite everything, despite the hurt, despite the betrayal, she was still the person whose words had cut the deepest earlier that night. I did not tell you, I said, my voice softer now but no less steady, because I believed that one day you would trust me without needing proof. I believed that being your sister would be enough, that my silence would not be mistaken for absence, but for something stronger, something you did not need to question. Her eyes filled with tears, then not dramatic, not forced, but quiet and real, and for a second I saw the sister I once knew, the one who had stood beside me years ago before assumptions replaced understanding, before distance grew where closeness once existed. I am sorry, she whispered, the words barely audible yet heavy with meaning, but I did not step closer. I did not reach out, because this moment was not about reclaiming what had been lost. It was about acknowledging what had changed. I gave a small nod, not dismissive, not cold, but final in its own quiet way, because forgiveness does not always mean returning to what was. Sometimes it simply means letting go of the need to hold on to pain. The groom's father was no longer trying to speak, his silence now complete, his posture diminished as the weight of the situation settled fully upon him. The respect that once surrounded him had shifted, replaced by doubt, by scrutiny, by the beginning of consequences that would follow far beyond this room. And as I looked at him, I did not feel triumph, I did not feel satisfaction in the way I once imagined revenge might feel. Instead there was something else, something quieter, something steadier. The knowledge that what needed to be done had been done, not for recognition, not for validation, but because it was right, because lives mattered more than reputations, because truth mattered more than comfort. I turned slightly, stepping back from the center of attention, allowing the officials to continue their process, because my part in this moment was already complete. I had spoken, I had stood, I had allowed the truth to take its place without fear, without hesitation, and that was enough. The room slowly began to shift again, but not back to what it had been. The energy had changed too deeply for that. Conversations remained hushed, movements careful, as if people were uncertain how to proceed in the aftermath of something that had redefined the entire evening. I realized then that this was what true change looked like. It was not loud, it was not dramatic in the way stories often portray it. It was quiet, it was undeniable, it settled into spaces and stayed there, forcing everyone to adjust to its presence. I picked up my purse once more, the same simple motion from earlier, but this time it carried a different meaning. It was no longer an escape, it was a choice, a decision to leave on my own terms without the weight of misunderstanding following me to the door. I took one last look around the hall, at the lights, at the guests, at my sister, who now stood surrounded by a silence that was entirely different from the one she had created earlier, and I felt no bitterness, only clarity. I showed up tonight, I said softly, not raising my voice, but knowing the words would carry, not despite my work, but because of it, because what I do matters, even when it is not seen, even when it is not understood. And I will not apologize for that. The words lingered in the air, not as a challenge, not as a defense, but as a simple statement of truth. And with that I turned, walking toward the exit with the same steady steps that had brought me forward moments ago. The doors opened once more, the cool night air greeting me again, but this time it did not feel sharp, it felt freeing, as if something heavy had finally been set down behind me. And as I stepped outside, I allowed myself a single deep breath, the kind that fills your lungs completely, the kind that reminds you that you are still standing, still moving, still in control of your own story. Because sometimes the sweetest revenge is not about proving others wrong in anger, it is about standing in your truth so completely that their doubts no longer have a place to exist. It is about letting the silence that once surrounded you transform into something powerful, something unshakable, something that speaks louder than any words ever could. And as I walked away from the lights, from the voices, from the version of myself they had Believed and I understood that this was not an ending, it was a beginning, a quiet, strong beginning built not on approval but on truth, and that was something no one could take from me ever again.